internet, did some research, and everywhere people compare you to Björk.
Yeah, for a long time it bothered me just because it didn't resonate with me as true, but the thing is, she's really good, so I've eventually tried to convince myself to not mind a comparison to someone who's good.
I think they... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Especially when you're first starting out, a comparison to anybody which appears again and again and again starts making your blood boil, because especially if you don't agree with it, if you don't see similarities, just because it feels limiting,
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I'm like, she's good. She's great. So.
She's great. I think it's partly because you're just such an original artist. And also, I didn't think so at all at first, but sometimes I do hear things in your voice that make me think of Björk, even though I think your work is very different.
Yeah.
So, and maybe it's also just the originality of your work that causes the comparison.
I'm the worst person of all at analyzing and seeing my own work with any objectivity, and so I certainly don't have much arsenal in arguing against comparisons to anybody, because I don't know what I sound like.
I can understand that.
Yeah. But at the same time, she was not an influence at all for me, and so for that reason, I think that I railed against comparisons, but it's all right. She's great. Yeah.
So if you talk about the new album, first of all, what does the title mean? How is it pronounced, etc., etc.?
Well, I think it should be pronounced East or Ease. It's possible it should be pronounced E, because it's a French, it's a word from Brittany, from Bretagne. So I know, for example, what is it, fleur de lis, the fleur de lis. Yeah, so that's pronounced Lee. So maybe East is actually pronounced E. I'm not quite sure, but because I'm American and my record is put out in the United States, I think it's fine to Americanize the pronunciation slightly.
Mm-hmm.
Most of all, it's not supposed to. It has a meaning for me, which is in reference to a myth. But I also thought it was effective as a title for an album, partially because it registers almost as a non-word, almost like an object. Mm-hmm. There's a real bluntness and almost like a violence to a really short, obscure word like that. It's like throwing a rock into the middle of this sort of austere, formal-looking, very carefully rendered record cover. It's packed with a lot of information, and so there's a certain baroqueness to it, just the way that it's dense with symbolic imagery and themes and so forth. And I liked the effect, the balancing or neutralizing effect, this harsh two-letter difficult word just sort of thrown in the middle of all that. But the myth that it refers to is an island in French Celtic mythology that was built. There was a city built on this island below sea level and surrounded by a wall. And the wall was breached and the sea came in. And there's all sorts of variations of this myth, but it's usually roughly interpreted as sort of a punishment for decadence, a decadent city that was covered up by the sea, and also sometimes interpreted as a metaphor for the triumph of Christianity over Druidism, because the only survivor of this flooded city was the Christian king who was able to ride out on a horse that could run on the water. And, I think one of the last druids, I can't remember he was supposed to have like buried and erected a church at the grave of like the last Druid in Brittany or something like that. Shouldn't say too much about that because I'm not sure I'm right about that part of the myth, but there were numerous parallels and synchronicities and appearances of common themes between this myth and the songs on the record. But the title was the last thing that I chose. So the songs are not about this myth or this island, but rather share so much in common in terms of themes that it seemed obvious to me that this myth was supposed to be the title when I encountered it.
Yeah. You just said that it's a Celtic myth. Now, you started out playing the Celtic harp, which is smaller than the harp you play now, I assume. How much did all this Celtic music, Celtic folklore and so on influence you?
Very little. Yeah, I don't know a great deal more than average about it. I started out on a Celtic harp because they're cheaper than a big classical harp. They're more affordable. They're easier for a child to start playing, and I was like 8 years old. So,
Are the strings softer than?
Indirectly, they can be because usually they're nylon instead of gut, and nylon is also cheaper, but it tends to be a little easier on the fingers. But I think the main reason is just that it's smaller. It's easier to reach your arms around, and it's lighter to carry, and it's cheaper and so forth.
How exhausting was it for you? I mean, how long were you able to practice on the harp when you were a child, when you started?
A long time, I think. I mean, I have no memory of a time in which getting tired was a reason to stop playing.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that probably happened, but I don't remember it.
Mm-hmm.
When the era of playing harp in which I start really remembering things is like I already knew how to play it.
Mm-hmm. I was just wondering, you had blisters on one of your concerts, and you ended up having to play the piano. Well, you had super glue on your fingertip. Was that the same concert, or?
I'm not sure. It actually happened quite a bit on that tour, several concerts, and it was totally my fault.
Yeah?
Because I had too much fun in the weeks leading up to that tour at home. I didn't practice nearly enough.
So your calluses weren't...
Yeah, my calluses wore down and softened, and then I went out on this tour and immediately blistered, and then the blisters burst because I couldn't rest my hands because I was playing every night, and then I had to super glue them because it was just bloody baby skin.
Ouch. So you ended up playing the piano for one of your, and I was just wondering how much of a difference there is between playing your songs on the piano and playing them on the harp, and if you have to practice a lot on the piano extra to be able to do that.
No, I should. It would be lovely. I'm sure that if I practice on the piano, I would be really happy with the fact that suddenly I could do things that I can't do now. But the transition is not a huge one at all. In fact, like I took piano lessons till I was like 10 years old and then stopped, and I hadn't touched a piano in at least a decade.
Well, you had played organ for a while, hadn't you? With the Pleased?
No, this is about the same era, but that was my boyfriend's band briefly, and it was just a keyboard, like with an electric keyboard with an organ sound. But I don't think I can play an organ. I don't think I've ever played an organ. No, I mean, even approximate playing on an organ. I can't remember ever trying to do that, so I don't think I did. But that period of time that you're talking about was when I finally revisited keyboard for the first time in about a decade.
Okay.
And discovered that at least roughly I could play my harp music like almost immediately on the piano. Although it gets a lot harder when the key. There are definitely difficult keys for me to play in because. But when the closer it is to like C major or like G major, something like that, like the transition is almost immediate. I think
Wow.
most harp players have discovered that with great delight because they're so similar.
That's interesting, yeah.
Okay, I mean, what most people will wonder about when they get this new record is, on the Milk Album, that there were these small songs, and it's progressed into something that I don't know how to call. And how did they get so long?
Well, the record, the decision to make them long songs was a decision that was made very early on in the process, and it was an extremely intuitive one rather than like a conceptual decision. And basically, the songs are basically represent an attempt to articulate and maybe even organize the events of the year that preceded the writing of these songs. And there were like 4 very huge events in my life, kind of at least 2 of which were the sorts of things that maybe at the end of your life considered to be the biggest thing that has ever happened to you, good or bad. But these things happen in extremely close succession. And the hugest one, which I don't like to talk about very much, but clearly is present on the record, is mortality. There was a death that was massive in my life, and then there was another event that might as well have been a death, but wasn't. That was also very big, and then 2 things that were very good, and I just felt like, perhaps that this record was an attempt to memorialize the year in which these things happened, but also I think to hold these things enough at a distance that I could start to make some sense of them and organize them, because of course always in any life that is examined by its owner, there are always going to be the same sort of themes and omens and connections and poetry that emerge out of a fiction, out of something that you've created in your imagination. The human life is just as productive of those things as the fictional life is. And so, this record is an autobiography, but it's also a recognition of synchronicity and sort of archetype and huge themes and so forth. So it wasn't extremely important to me that the true story, the factual story, be explicit to any listener, but what was important to me was that the themes that were produced and the sort of thematic story that was floating above all of it was on some level palpable to the listener, even if it was just an impressionistic experience. But I recognized very early on, after deciding that I wanted to endeavor to tackle this particular subject matter, I recognized really early on that I needed to make the songs long, and that it would be sort of pointless and certainly vulgar to try to fit them into a short song form. And probably impossible, I thought. I think that I wouldn't have gotten very far if I tried to do that, because there's sort of an inherent pacing, for example. The ideas had to develop at a certain rate, and I didn't want to leave anything out. I didn't want to neglect anything in the story. So I knew the songs had to be long, and I also roughly knew that there had to be 5 of them, because of the 5 songs, 4 ended up concerning itself primarily with one of these events, while still connecting to and mentioning and bringing in the other 3 events. So there's those 4 songs, and then the 5th one, which is the 4th track on the record, is an attempt to include all 4 events equally. And so there was a real, it wasn't conceptual exactly, it was just sort of like an instinctive and very obvious decision.
Thanks for telling us which song it was, because I was now starting to wonder which is the song. And I thought it was either the 2nd or the 5th.
Oh, yeah. Well, the 2nd one is obvious. Well, I think it's obvious that it is I mean, it sort of starts out in a kind of fictional way, like a narrative, like a fable type narrative that is probably the most, well, certainly the most conventional, like, story song I've ever written. But part of that was an attempt to establish a tone that I could then just like globally just fuck over by the end. You know, like it's like plods along slowly but surely and like unravels, and then there's a moment at the end where it just all hell breaks loose in terms of the.
It's so gorgeous. You may have answered my question already, because I've always wondered about the end where Bear leaves Bear.
Yeah.
If Bear is liberated in the sense that she's left her former life, or if she's liberated in the sense that she's left life altogether.
Right.
Is that something you'd like to leave up in the air?
Yeah, it's a real intentional ambiguity because it's one of the questions of the record as a whole. So to answer it would maybe not be helpful for the record as a whole to answer it. So
yeah, well, it seems like death, but then there's also the line, Bear wouldn't drown or Bear can't drown, and so there's still this question of, did she just leave her old life behind, or did she leave her entire Bear self behind, or
Well,
so.
I mean, I don't know if this is a cue or whatever, but like, a big theme of that song is like this sort of blind, fumbling, and decadent journey. Like, not really a heroic journey, but just sort of like
A very manipulative journey as well.
Certainly.
Yes.
But always with the goal being like this vague sort of fulfillment, like a feast, or like the ability to unchain yourself and like take off your, costume and like be wild and all of these things. And even in the end, the bear's fur coat is dragging through the water, catching all the fish.
So beautiful.
Like a big feast or whatever. So, I mean, it's certainly supposed to be ambiguous, but definitely is a reference to death.
We have to talk about Van Dyke Parks.
Yes, of course.
Definitely.
How did you get in touch with him? How did this collaboration come about? How did it start?
Let's see. But I had recognized about, 2/3 of the way in making the record. Well, 2 of the songs were completed and 3 songs were not yet completed when I recognized that I needed to have an orchestra be involved. And it was kind of another intuitive but unquestionable decision. Like, well, of course, I have to have an orchestra involved. And so I wrote 3 of those songs basically from the ground up, intending that they accommodate an orchestra, like that there be a real spaciousness in the writing that I wasn't used to allowing to be, just because I wanted there to be an orchestra present there. But for a good while, I didn't know who I wanted to realize that for me. And I thought maybe I was going to try to arrange the orchestra myself, which was sort of a ridiculous idea, but I thought maybe I could do it. I'd like studied a little orchestration in composition school and stuff, and I was like, I can do it. I know what I want it to sound like, but I realized at a certain point that I would be less capable of creating the exact sound that I wanted than a better arranger, a better composer could do if I just gave them really explicit instructions. And so I just was trying to decide for months, like as I was finishing writing these songs, trying to decide who would be the right person. And at some point, someone gave me a present of Van Dyke's first record, Song Cycle, and I loved it. And by like the third listen, decided like, oh, this is it. This is the one. Like, this is him. And totally had no idea that he was like Van Dyke Parks of, like the last 40 odd years of, extraordinary work. I just knew this one record. And so brazenly, without realizing what I was doing, like I asked my record label to contact him, and they humored me and didn't make me feel like I was being ridiculous. And he, in turn, very sweetly agreed to come with his wife, Sally, and meet me in a hotel room in Los Angeles where I had rented a harp, and like they sat on the edge of the hotel room bed and listened to me playing these 5 songs, and said very lovely, beautiful things to me, and then agreed to do the project.
Wow.
There it was pretty insane. And then we worked for 6 months, and he was the person who requested that I start by recording my final harp track and final vocal track, rather than recording live with an orchestra at the end of the process, because he recognized the fact that I slightly varied my performance every time I played, and because he works on such a detailed level with his arrangements, I think he recognized that any slight change on my part after the fact was going to create some like retroactive awkwardness, like with this arrangement that he had very carefully matched to like a previous performance, and so he wanted to feel confident that the performance would remain totally unchanged. And I was a little disappointed by that, because I had like imagined, like I think I wanted to be like Harry Nilsson, like sitting in the middle of an orchestra pit, like something like that. But it was a really good thing that he asked this of me, because what it ended up allowing for was a recording of the vocal and harp track that sort of exists completely independent of the presence of the orchestra. I think like if I had sat down and recorded with an orchestra, I would have been really inhibited, probably. Like so nervous about making a mistake and messing up and having to start over, that it would have caused a real, I would have held back quite a bit. And so, because I recorded by myself, just with Steve Albini, like in this little room in Los Angeles, there was a real inhibition and freedom and spontaneity, and like obviously I had access to the same emotions that I was working with when I recorded them, and I didn't feel distanced in any way. So it was very good to do it that way. And then I gave that recording to Van Dyke along with like 30 pages of notes, like a manifesto about like what I wanted the record to sound like, as well as like a line-by-line description of what I wanted, and then started generating these drafts of arrangements, and then I would hit him back with like notes and edits, and I didn't edit it, but like requests for, can you change this, can you change this, can you change this, and then he would very good-humoredly and tirelessly produce another draft. And it was kind of ironic that it took 6 months, because the very first thing he ever gave me was like exquisite and beautiful, and he's a complete genius always, but I was so particular about what I wanted, how I wanted it to sound, and the mood. And of course there was like a real sacredness to the whole process. Like I felt like anything that was a variation away from what I wanted was like a desecration, it was like a huge deal, and I just was utterly inflexible because of that. And he put up with my inflexibility with great grace. He understood and just kept churning out these drafts until the arrangement was what it was supposed to be, and that took 6 months.
Was there ever a point in these 6? I think somewhere I read that you said it was 8 months. But I don't know if I'm mistaken. Was there ever a point where you thought, well, this is not going to work out, or where you became frustrated with the process?
I think I was probably frustrated at times, but I don't think that it was ever because of thinking it wouldn't work out in the end. Because Van Dyke really, the way that he is really conducive to good faith. Like, he's such a hard worker and such a good man and believes so much in the project that, he would just, like, when I was frustrated or whatever, he was like, we'll get it, like, we're getting there, like, you're gonna love it, I swear you're gonna love it, and he was right.
Mm-hmm. Was there a lot of money involved in this thing? I mean, he had to orchestrate 40 people, I think, and somewhere in the booklet you write, or somebody writes that, thank you for copying and notating and that stuff. So I reckon it must have cost quite a lot.
Yeah, there are aspects of making an orchestral recording that where money is totally non-negotiable for, obviously. So paying a room full of union orchestral musicians certainly was a lot of money, and it was pretty rad that my little label worked it out and paid for it. But all the other people I worked with, Jim O'Rourke, Steve Albini, Van Dyke, I think believed in the project quite a bit because all of them made it possible, made it easy to afford an orchestra, for example. I mean, by making their own services extremely affordable. Like, a lot of people did a lot of really big favors in order to make this little record label be able to afford to make a record that usually would have to be on a major label to be possible. So
I did wonder about that. Wow, yeah.
it was a lot of people showed a lot of faith in it and worked really hard to, it was like at least 6 months of Van Dyke's life, for example, and he really, really didn't charge very much.
Mm-hmm.
And, word on the street in Hollywood is that he's the most expensive arranger to work with in town.
That's a huge compliment for you, then.
Well, I mean, I was certainly complimented, but I think it's mainly a real example of Van Dyke's goodness and also,
love of music.
And love of music.
Mm.
And also he's reasonable, I think. Like, if he works with U2, then he'll charge something, commensurate to what makes sense because it's U2. But so I think that he's just a reasonable person in that regard. If he wants to do a project, he'll do it, and he'll charge an amount of money that reflects what he knows they can afford.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about tradition, I've been doing that recently so often with other singer-songwriters, so I'd like to ask you too. You once stated that two of your musical influences are Texas Gladden and Ruth Crawford Seeger. Never before in my life heard about it.
Yeah.
So, first thing, how did you get to hear them? And second, do you see a line running between them and you, so that you do it as part of an ongoing process?
I'm not sure where I first encountered Texas Gladden. I know I was probably 19 or 20 years old, so I didn't grow up knowing her music. And Ruth Crawford Seeger I encountered for the first time when I was studying composition in school, and a teacher familiarized me with her music. I'm not sure if I see a line from them to me. I think to suggest that in either of their cases would be a little pompous for totally different reasons. I mean, Texas Gladden was she was a folk singer, you know, I mean, like, she sang traditional ballads, she worked her ass off, you know, like she was a grandma, her songs were incredibly functional, like, I mean, there was some interview with her where she explained, like, you sing to put a baby to sleep, you know, you sing, like, there's always a point to your songs, and, like, I have the luxury of having grown up in a household in which you can just sing well, I didn't sing growing up, but you can play music for music's sake. Ruth Crawford Seeger, I see as representative of a seamless ability to transition between and to see no distinction between folk music and art music, new music, experimental music. And so I certainly look to her as a reminder that such a thing is possible with very little compromise or no compromise. I mean, she was an incredibly gifted composer, and I think, you know, did produce some of the most incredible work within sort of this dissonant counterpoint school of thought that was happening sort of among her contemporaries at that time. And I mean, she was enormously revolutionary and experimental and imaginative and boundlessly creative. Mm-hmm. And then she, you know, also sort of took part in this work with the Lomax brothers, you know, collecting field recordings and preserving them and actually totally popularizing them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think a lot of people forget about this or maybe don't know about this, but she had a lot to do with the 60s folk revival indirectly, because she put out in, I think, the early 50s, I could be wrong about this, but I think maybe the early 50s, she put out this book of children's folk songs. And at that time, that they were totally unknown to mainstream America. And, you know, they were the most popular and mainstream sort of outgrowth of the work that the Lomaxes had done at that point. I mean, I know now a lot of that stuff is well known and popular and appreciated, but at the time they were still just sort of these scientists, these ethnomusicologists, these, you know, ethnographers, and just sort of their work was not paid much attention to in the mainstream. And so Ruth Crawford Seeger put out this book of some of the children's folk songs that the Lomaxes had collected and archived, and that had a massive effect on American culture. And then, of course, the children that she raised with the composer Charles Seeger, her husband, ended up being Pete Seeger, Mike Seeger, Peggy Seeger, and they, I mean, it can be no coincidence that these huge participants in the American folk revival were her children. I mean, I'm sure that they grew up, I mean, in a household in which their mom had once been this amazing composer and then had moved into sort of a huge involvement in folk music, and their father remained an experimental sort of big composer, and they went in the direction of their mother's path, which I think indicates the extent to which she placed value on folk music and wasn't snobby about it, wasn't elitist about it, didn't see it as like something down here compared to the work that she had done in the art music world. And I mean, she's representative of sort of like a cultural goal in my mind, but as far as her actual music goes, I mean, it's very different from mine.
Mentioning Pete Seeger, I mean, I remember reading about him that when Bob Dylan first appeared at the Newport, not the first time, but when he went electric, as people say nowadays, the Newport Folk Festival, 65 or something, Pete Seeger actually tried to cut the cable with an axe or something. So he didn't see this as, or he saw some sort of breach that between Dylan and the traditional folk song. When we look back from our perspective nowadays, we see Bob Dylan's work as part of this tradition. I think so, and I think many people think so. Do you think that this could apply to you also someday in the future?
Well, I have never identified myself as a folk musician in the first place, and I've furthermore never remotely identified myself as part of a scene, and have protested again and again when people have associated me with a movement or a scene. Not because I have any disdain for a scene or movement, but because I truly believe it doesn't exist, as do many of the other people who get placed in that context. And
yes, and Bob Dylan didn't do that.
sure, although, I mean, you'll know that Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger were friends for a while and traveled together and toured together, so it wasn't like Pete Seeger always thought of Bob Dylan as breaking away from something. He just protested against the electricity, the rock and roll thing, and of course at the time, the style of rock and roll that Bob Dylan was playing was perceived as pandering to the mainstream. Like it was perceived as like him breaking away from something revolutionary and certainly not experimental, but at least subversive. Him breaking away from that into like these sort of radio-ready, like inoffensive mainstream sounds, what people associated with the mainstream, and there was a huge closed-mindedness where they couldn't get past like their associations with like the grooves that he was playing to like note that what he was saying was as incredibly poetic and interesting and subversive as ever, and that was almost more dangerous for him to bring his sound like into the mainstream to that extent and still be saying pretty interesting things. Pete Seeger was divisive. He broke away. I mean, he was one of the folks like really popularizing protest songs. I mean, he took folk music, which was often much more of sort of like an oral history, storytelling, inclusive form. He took that and turned it into a very divisive, politically motivated, left-leaning, non-mainstream form. And I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that either, but it is sort of ironic that he did that, but he couldn't handle Dylan like doing something equally, sort of breaking away to an equal extent. I mean, I know Pete Seeger didn't make up protest songs. I know he was a huge disciple of Woody Guthrie and so forth, but that was all he did, basically, was that type of music.
Yeah. I'm still looking for a last very good question.
Oh.
Maybe while I'm searching, maybe you can fill it in.
I had one question. The Sawdust and Diamonds song is the only song on the album without orchestration, and I found it very interesting listening to it on the headphones. You described that Steve Albini had a very unusual way of miking the harp, but you wouldn't tell us how he did it in case he wanted to do it again. And listening to it, I was just astounded the first time because the way it's recorded, your voice and the harp seem like twins to me, or like sisters somehow, because there's a very similar sort of scratchiness around the edge. And also, this scratchiness reminds me of bird wings, and so and that fits so well into the theme, into the lyrics of the song, this bird wing scratchiness on the edge of your voice and on the edge of the harp sound. I wondered if that was sort of somehow intentional on Steve Albini's part.
Maybe.
Or if it was just serendipity somehow.
It could have just been serendipity. I do know that his choice of microphone for the vocals specifically did connect to what the songs are about. We talked about like what we want the song to feel like, what we want it to sound like, how close we want it to be, whether this is more like experienced, distant song or like whether it's an extremely like close, raw one, and he would choose microphones accordingly.
Can you tell me what kind of microphone he ended up using for the voice?
For that one, I don't remember the brand. I don't know a great deal about microphones, so mainly it was him describing like this will make it sound like this or whatnot. The only one I remember specifically is Monkey and Bear. We used an old murky like RCA ribbon microphone that was like this big.
Wow.
You know?
Wow. Yeah.
But also I think maybe what you described is partially due to the mix because Jim O'Rourke did a pretty.
So maybe it's Jim
job.
O'Rourke's
perhaps
thing.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard for me to know for sure where one of their roles ends and the other begins. But I do know that Jim did incredible detail work with the mix. Like for that song, it took him as long to mix Song of Some Diamonds as it took him to mix the other songs, you know. And it involved him like writing the vocal tracks the entire time, like with reverb, for example, like choosing based on each line, like there were certain words where he like swathed them in a tiny bit of reverb and then drop it out instantaneously for the next word. Like he like carved the most precise shape out of the song. So
amazing, yeah.
So
Fascinating.
It makes me think maybe he had something to do with that.
Maybe it was his thing.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
I've got one. I don't know if it's intelligent or not, but I'll try. Your lyrics are full of strange and seldom used words. I think Dr. Johnson called them incorn terms. You know, like the bear, I think he goes spelunking or something. I think, is that a German word or a Jewish word or something? Where do these words come from? Where do you get them from?
Well, let me see if I can explain that real briefly. I fundamentally oppose the use of like obscure words for the creation of something like a period piece. You know, just arbitrarily plucking like an older word out of, you know, the lexicon, like just for the sake of saying something that sounds a little cool. But I think that sometimes a strange word is useful because when I choose lyrics, music is a huge influencing factor. If I was writing these lines, if I was telling the same story independent of music, if I was writing it as a poem or as a short story, I would choose completely different words. For that section of the song, there's a rhythmic pattern that was necessary, and it went ba 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 ba. So the fourth beat of every 4 beats had to be emphasized, and that was like counter meter to the one that was being played with the harp. And as such, I needed the 4th syllable of each word to naturally be emphasized. And I wanted there to be a back and forth rhyming pattern. Every other 4-beat based figure needed to rhyme. And so as it happened, I needed a word right there that first of all conveyed the meaning I wanted, which was to go into a cave, and second of all, rhymed with monkey, and third of all, emphasize the proper syllable. And so the only word in the whole world that describes that and sounds that way and has that beat is spelunking. And anytime I use a weird word, it is because it has to have exact meaning and not be arbitrary and say exactly what I need to say and also have the right beat and everything.
That's why we love you.
Thank you.
That was a very good last word, but I'd still like to know how old you are at the moment.
Oh, 24.
So you are 24.
Yes.
Just get very briefly, when did you start writing songs? That's the last one.
I'm not sure when I started writing songs, but I know at least very rudimentary tunes. I was assigned to start writing and did start writing from my first lesson ever. I had a teacher who emphasized songwriting and improvisation just as much as everything else. So, first lesson, 8 years old.
8 years old. Oh, very good. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
We could talk about 5 hours. But I see the necessity that other people want.
Internal error